kind introduction, and it's really a delight to be here this evening to speak to you about an issue that I'm sure is of interest to many of us here. But allow me to start by thanking Dr. Ike, the faculty and members of the Africa Leadership Center in the School of Global Affairs here at King's for this opportunity to speak and share ideas within the hallowed precincts of this great citadel of learning. I felt a deep sense of nostalgia when I arrived here 6 months ago as a visiting scholar, 30 years after I left as a student. King's was not this beautiful when I was here as a student. And we were only located in this pokey, choky, macadam building, Strand. I think we were beginning to extend to Waterloo campus then, but there was no Bush House, and there was no Virginia Woolf building. And all of this extended, and there was no connection. There was a road actually between Bush House and Strand building. I think it's closed off now, and it's more like a piazza. A beautiful one at that. Colleagues like Dylan would also remember that period I'm talking about very well. So for me, nostalgic to be back here, and having been here for 6 months off and on now as a visiting scholar, I've had the opportunity to actively engage with our students and the faculty on a wide range of subjects, reflecting on my experience in civil society and in government. I've specifically spoken to faculty and students on governance at the subnational level in Nigeria, on the Ekiti experience where I governed for 8 years. I've also had a seminar on the challenge of democratic leadership, reviewing 20 years of democratization in Nigeria, and also led a postgraduate workshop on the leadership piece, Nexus, sharing the experience of a scholar politician on the work that we have done in those areas. And all of these engagements form a part of my activity as a visiting faculty here, in addition to the commitment I've given to write a book at the end of my time here. But this keynote is my first engagement with the wider public outside of ALC, and on a subject matter of great interest, I believe, to many. I want to particularly thank Professor Fumiolani Shaki and Abiodun Alao, who is not here, and Dr. Adioti Dipoli for putting this together and for all the arrangements, getting all of you here. In speaking of shifts in global power relations and its implications for Africa, I intend to make 3 distinct yet interconnected arguments in this lecture. The first is to underscore the importance of history in shaping our understanding of the shifting global dynamics that we're witnessing. The second seeks to interrogate the pace, the process, the trajectory, context, and implications of the changes in the global power relations. And the third, to explore the centrality of Africa in the reshaping of the world, and the criticality of Africa becoming a co-role maker in the emerging new world order. Our world today is dotted by many theaters of war and conflict. 2 of such conflicts readily come to mind. The Ukrainian conflict, which has been on for more than a year now, and lately the human catastrophe currently playing out in the Middle East, and arguably the bloodiest in the seeming intractable conflict between Israel and Palestine. Closer home in Africa, we have the multifaceted conflicts in the Sahel, the Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Congo, and a few other places. One major imperative of all these conflicts is the need to pay closer attention to some of the traditional assumptions that underpin our international system and the global order as we know it. But beyond the internecine conflicts are also the other common challenges that confront us all, such as the crisis of climate change and the scourge of pandemics, which have significantly impacted our world in the past few years and presented new issues for global governance systems, both as causes and consequences of new and existential problems. Growing inequality, not only along the north and south axis of the globe, but within regions and nations, major demographic shifts, the interconnected problem of irregular migration and refugees across international borders, as well as declining trust in government and intergovernmental institutions. While none of these problems is totally new, the sheer scale and the complexities are not what we're familiar with. And this is why our established global governance systems that have functioned relatively well in the past now appear ineffective and inadequate. Today, we're living witnesses to changes, including the radical redistribution of economic power that presages the end of the post-1945 multilateral system and its replacement by a new world order characterized by competing centers of power and influence. Indeed, it is the process of the gradual decomposition of the post-1945 multilateral system and the Pax Americana that underpinned it that is at the heart of the turbulence that we now witness. Periods of transition from one global order to another tend to occur gradually, sometimes even imperceptibly for a period. However, the forces of change that undergird the transition progress inexorably until the shift that they bring about bursts into the open. The transitional periods, characterized by the triple dynamics of decomposition, recomposition, and redistribution of power, tend to be marked by turbulence, instability, and even violence. This clearly is the evidence from history. At the height of the global hegemony of Great Britain and its enforced Pax Britannica, the capacity of the state to rule the waves on account of its industrial prowess and superior naval power placed it in a position to enforce its will and demand compliance. However, even Pax Britannica did not go unchallenged by the European rivals such as France and later Germany, but also from emerging new centers of power such as the United States, which, though previously a colony of the United Kingdom, was rapidly coming to its own and assuming an important role as a pole of global economic growth and political influence. Although the decline of Pax Britannica began long before the onset of the First World War, that war, as well as the Second World War that inevitably followed it, marked its symbolic and substantive end. And it was a violent end that claimed millions of lives. In the interwar years, the world experienced massive convulsions that included the Great Depression and the economic and social dislocations that came with it. The air in Europe was filled with revolutionary fervor, even as anti-colonial national liberation movements in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America gathered momentum. The ill-fated League of Nations, an intergovernmental child of extremely difficult circumstances, that was overwhelmed from that by the many crises that were playing out, and which was further incapacitated by the rising tide of fascism in Europe, also finally collapsed. Pax Britannica was replaced by Pax Americana, with the United States emerging formally as the single most powerful economic and political force in the world. The global economic dominance of the United States was largely projected by transnational corporations and the preeminent position that the US dollar came to assume in international finance, commerce, and investment. Combined with its massive military capacity and its ability to deploy power on a global scale, it's not surprising that the United States took a lead role in the making of the new global multilateral system that was built at the end of the Second World War, and at the heart of which lies the United Nations family of organizations, including the Bretton Woods twins, the World Bank, and the IMF. Indeed, Pax Americana as a concept and practice may have embodied the preeminent position of the United States in global affairs after the Second World War. However, it was also subject to contestation, just like Pax Britannica. From the outset by Russia, which stood opposite the United States and its allies in the West in terms of political ideology and strategic interest. Russia, having paid a heavy price in lives lost during the Second World War, was determined to consolidate the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics under a revolutionary socialist banner. In the Cold War that ensued, and which eventually came to frame global politics until the 1990s, Russia bolstered its military arsenal to become a credible rival and competitor to the United States in the deployment of massively destructive military capability. The politics of deterrence, such as it played out, effectively meant that no overt effort was made by either of the two biggest nuclear powers to interfere in the sphere of influence that they had carved out for themselves and sought to control. The USSR, with Russia at its core, may have successfully matched the United States in the military, political, ideological fields. However, it struggled economically, and in the face of serious internal pressure and contradictory ambition of its members, the Union had to succumb to an eventual collapse. Not a few commentators, including, for a time at least, the well-known Francis Fukuyama, were quick to adopt a triumphalist end of history narrative, which projected the United States either on its own or with its Western allies as the last man standing in an ideological battle that had lasted for about half a century. Capitalism, they told us, had triumphed over socialism, Marxism, communism, and liberal democracy had won over the authoritarian system of democratic centralism that the Soviets had practiced. So such a terminal moment in history, after which there will be no further challenge to capitalism and liberal democracy as economic and political ideologies. In the words of Fukuyama, it was the end of history. Fukuyama himself was to later admit that his proclamation of the end of history in the immediate aftermath of the dissolution of the USSR and its Warsaw Pact and Comecon was, to state it politely, a little premature. For out of the rubble of the whole USSR, the Russian Federation reconstituted itself as an independent power, which also claimed and retained the massive nuclear arsenal of the old Soviet Union. It may have been somewhat weakened by the collapse of the Union, but it was not entirely out. And it was only a matter of time, and the accession of Vladimir Putin to power for a resurgent Russia to reposition itself as a major force and power broker in its own right, complete with an upgraded arsenal of conventional and non-conventional forces, It's the conventional components of that arsenal that are presently being put to test by the US-led NATO in the war that is ongoing in Ukraine. The unipolar moment, which the United States may have enjoyed as the sole remaining superpower still standing, now seem destined to be short-lived. Indeed, any conception of a unipolar world order under the untrammeled hegemony of America, which looked so inevitable at the turn of the millennium, now appears improbable. Even as Russia embarked on a path of rapid military political resurgence, China has led a pack of countries such as India, Turkey, Brazil, and a host of other middle powers to challenge the economic dominance of the United States. The resurgence of China as an economic, if not a political power bloc, has been especially rapid and comprehensive that the relegation of the United States economy to a second place appeared to have happened without any major resistance. And beyond being the factory of the world, China today holds the biggest foreign exchange reserve and has expanded its international trade, investment, and foreign aid profiles. It has also enhanced its competitiveness in science, technology, and innovation, while growing its soft power, particularly through the Belt and Road Initiative. Perhaps most significantly, China has also been carrying out a single-minded modernization and expansion of its military capability. The massive financial resources at its disposal has enabled it to invest in reinforcing its defensive and offensive capabilities on a scale which has already placed it among the topmost military powers in the world. Many analysts now think it is only a matter of time before China becomes a blue water naval power. Yet, coming closely behind are other actors, mostly middle powers, who are also asserting their global geopolitical interests more autonomously and more aggressively, thereby contributing to the much more diffuse nature of power and influence in the present situation. And a good example in this regard would be the BRICS nations. Scholars seeking to characterize the current international balance of power among nations talk about the emergence of the multipolar global order, with multiple competing centers coexisting, albeit uneasily. I suggest that multipolarity itself speaks to a global reordering in which the old is dying simultaneously as the new is struggling to be born, just as Antonio Gramsci told us years ago. It is a tense and delicate transitional moment in human history that is packed with doubts and fears. As old certitudes are dissolved and new pecking orders emerge, existing global governance institutions find themselves struggling to cope with a nascent new order in a state of flux. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres aptly puts it recently, and I quote him, "We're now at an inflection point. Power dynamics have become increasingly fragmented as new poles of influence emerge, new economic blocks form, and axes of contestation are redefined." Although not surprisingly, it is important to note that the emerging multipolarity is also happening alongside a new arms race, which has seen an unprecedented expansion of military spending in recent years, especially by the old powers, with military expenditures globally reaching a new record of $2.24 trillion in 2022, according to CIPRI and IISS, committed to boosting their defensive and offensive arsenals and proliferating military bases around the world. And as more countries acquire nuclear capabilities, the old fear of a mutually assured destruction is no longer about East and West. New axes of nuclear triggers now exist, and the fear of a nuclear conflict has once again become an active part of public discourse. The precarious balance underpinning the evolving multipolar system requires enlightened leadership on all sides. Yet, it is precisely the kind of leadership that has increasingly been in short supply around the world. Narrow nationalism, raw xenophobia, blatant fear-mongering, and belligerent militarism now overwhelm the political space and constrict avenues for constructive dialogue that is so necessary in navigating a world faced with unprecedented disequilibrium. We have seen it in Ukraine, and we're currently witnessing it in Palestine. As the drums of war are beating, and events are increasingly being tendentiously interpreted through what looks like a new Cold War prism, it would appear, like many observers have noted, that we have never edged nearer to a third world war than now. Some have even suggested that what we're witnessing in Ukraine and Palestine are indeed a prelude, if not the first act of a new world war. Even as precarious as this situation is, there is yet another dimension to it that we cannot ignore. When one looks at the various conflicts raging around the world, the temptation to define the crisis that we face in military terms alone is quite high. However, the existential threats that we face have greater ramifications than military conflict and requires even a higher level of leadership and global cooperation. Through ever more frequent and frightening forest fires, floods, hurricanes and tornadoes, rising temperatures, irregularities in weather patterns, and the attendant droughts and famine, climate change is taking its toll on people and economies everywhere. Internal and cross-border migrations triggered or accelerated by climate change have in turn revived ethno-regional consciousness and produced serious intercommunal clashes over water resources, land and pasture among farmers and pastoralists. International migration, undertaken through the most hazardous routes, have met with the rising tide of racist populism and extreme right nationalism that is changing the face of politics in the world, particularly in Europe and North America. Our world is caught today in a vortex of multidimensional and mutually reinforcing crises that can only be solved by a more united world. What then are the implications of these imminent changes for Africa? It is evident that the crises and instability that are racking the international system in this period of transition has not spared the African continent. This has manifested largely through the spate of security challenges arising from radical extremist claims, mostly tinged with questionable religious and ethnic motives, that have called the secular state into question and challenged its constitutional foundations. Although not limited to Africa, the continent has borne some of the harshest and most prolonged brunt of violence and insecurity perpetrated by local franchisees of Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Ansarud, and other global networks of militants committed to the violent pursuit of an alternative vision of governance and development, clothed in a contestable jihadist ideology. The Boko Haram group, which started as a small, highly localized movement, has flourished to encompass huge swaths of northern Nigeria and the entire Lake Chad Basin. The entire Sahel belt, stretching from west to East Africa, has been in a state of continuous turmoil. For nearly a decade, resulting in unconstitutional change of government, recently in Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, and now Niger. The Horn of Africa has equally been the hotbed of devastating conflicts in Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Sudan. Official estimates put the fatalities from the Tigray conflict alone at over 600,000 deaths, while the ongoing carnage in Sudan has already accounted for thousands of deaths, turning homes into cemeteries, with 6 million displaced people according to the latest United Nations figures. The continent is also witnessing increased activities of rogue mercenary groups, whose modus operandi reflect the transnational nature of organized crime, such as the Wagner groups, operations in the Sahel, and parts of the Horn of Africa. It is not unusual in periods of transition in global order for those countries that are the weakest link in the chain of power and influence to bear some of the biggest costs of change. Africa has been badly hit by turbulence emanating from outside its boundaries, whether it is COVID-19 pandemic, the 2007-2008 subprime economic crisis, fallouts from the global ambitions of new axes of power, or even the global climate change as a result of sustainable production practices. Even though Africa contributes only less than 3% of the entire carbon emission, the burden of climate change is heavily located also in the continent. Without doubt, turbulence in the international system has been refracted into Africa to generate new problems or exacerbate pre-existing social and economic conditions on the continent. In addition to rising poverty, growing inequality, currency depreciation, mounting inflationary pressures, and persistently high levels of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, a new external debt crisis is hovering over many African countries, which potentially undermines the sovereignty of these countries and threatens another round of austerity and externally imposed adjustment, if not quickly contained. Historic social gains of the early post-independence years and the early wins of the fourth decade of the return to democratic politics has seen Africa move from the season of Afro-pessimism of a hopeless continent so-called, credit to the economists, to a season of Afro-optimism of Africa rising. Unfortunately, the season of Afro-optimism now appears short-lived, leading back to a season of anomie, where the legitimacy of the state itself is being contested and liberal democracy is increasingly threatened. In the face of this season of anomie, the temptation is strong and has already been manifested to resort to fragmented, disjointed, and uncoordinated actions that produce dysfunctional outcomes and are likely ineffectual in dealing with the most severe threats to peace and security on the continent. Yet, with the erosion of the institutional capacity of the average African state, triggered by both internal and external factors, African countries, big or small, have leveraged on efforts to seek a common response to the problems of security and stability within their respective boundaries or across contiguous boundaries. Historically, post-Cold War Africa has demonstrated a robust understanding of common security needs, cross-border nature of security challenges, the need for collective response to regional issues, and coordination and harmonization of actions and policies by external actors. These have been demonstrated through collective commitment to certain principles and values, with the establishment of common protocols, norms, and standards, both at the continental level, at the African Union, and at the regional level, with bodies like ECOWAS, SADC, IGAD, East African Community, to which all their stakeholders subscribe. For a period, this seemed to have worked well to the great credit and pride of the continent. However, it appears that many of these regional peace initiatives seem to be losing steam or gaining less traction. And two examples in recent times will surface here. It took the continental body African Union close to a year to work out a formula to tackle the Tigray conflict. We are also witnessing, rather helplessly, the unfolding carnage in Sudan without the operationalization of any continental framework or roadmap 6 months after the outbreak of conflict. This has exposed the creeping weakness of the regional and sub-regional institutions mandated to tackle threats to peace and security at both the sub-regional and continental level. However, this need not be so, and nor should it be allowed to continue. Every change comes with serious adaptive challenges. Embedded in every change, and even the crisis it produces, are also huge opportunities. For us in Africa, one clear opportunity in the current development is the chance to win ample autonomous space within which to advance our ambitions of structural transformation, and in doing so, take a stand as a co-rule maker as the new global order gets fashioned out. We can do this by collectively leveraging on our comparative advantage, Africa's sheer numbers and demographic assets give it a major opportunity to influence the coming world order. According to the United Nations, by 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African. In 1950, 100 years ago, only 8% of Africans made up the entire world population. For 2050, 25% of the entire world population will come from Africa. By 2040, Africa will have a larger working age population than the rest of the entire world combined. The median age on the African continent now is 19. In India, it is 28. In China and the United States, it's 38. With the appropriate investments in education, in healthcare, and in infrastructure, the continent's productive potential will significantly increase. It will also boost demand from aging industrialized nations for skilled human capital. Apart from the human resources, the region's abundant natural resources, if properly harnessed, could increase Africa's strategic importance at the global marketplace. The region boasts 90% of the world's platinum and cobalt reserves, half of its gold supply, 35% of global uranium deposits, 2/3 of the supply of manganese, and nearly 75% of the world's coltan. A block of influential African economies acting together to offer privileged access to specific natural resources in exchange for more robust and transparent financing for critical infrastructure projects, a more flexible network of security relationships, pragmatic negotiations from climate finance to debt relief, or market access for African exports will be more effective provided this is handled as a collective rather than individual countries going it alone. Finally, let me spend a bit of time left on the need to address the scope of dependency, impact of population dynamics, and visionary leadership in response to the challenges of the multipolar moment. Based on current trends and evidence, there is no doubt that awareness is widespread in Africa about the potential opportunities from which the continent can profit at a time of global transformation. However, translating that awareness into comprehensive national level policy and collective continental action has proved to be daunting and elusive so far. Too many among African leaders are still trapped in outdated models of conducting interstate affairs, in a manner that either wittingly or unwittingly reinforces old dependencies or steers them into new ones. Interest among competitor international actors in the various resources and endowments of the continent, human, mineral, land, agriculture, water, rainforest, markets, geostrategic opportunity, has not so far been successfully harnessed to serve African priorities. Instead, encouraged to act individually before actors that are far more powerful than them. African countries have accumulated external debts from both West and the East in a relationship that has laid them bare and vulnerable. And And this is where I believe visionary leadership must come in to help in developing a strategic, coordinated, coherent, and shared African approach to managing the turbulence in the international system as the process of change gathers momentum. The underlying goal must be to ensure that amidst the turbulence, Africans and all peoples of African descent do not become casualties and cannon fodders as various interests compete for advantage or supremacy. We must also ensure that the hard-won sovereignty of African countries is jealously guarded and is not compromised on the altar of any external help in whatever guise. While Africa needs to actively promote a vision of multilateralism in a world in transition, it must do so within the context of strategic autonomy. Visionary African leadership, fit for these turbulent times, will additionally demand close attention to the new global order that is evolving slowly and even chaotically, but surely. When the key pillars of the post-1945 global order that has now come under strain were established, most of Africa was under direct colonial rule, and global Africa was under the weight of political oppression and exclusion. Today, the continent has every reason to assume a seat at the table and play the role of a joint rule maker for the new order that is emerging. But for this to happen, Africa requires nothing less than a complete reset in our approach. And this begins with refusing to be corralled into the corner of any of the competing powers and insisting that the only thing that matters is the advancement of the needs and dignity of Africans at home and the global Africa at large. And to advance our own core interests and values, African leadership must also, of necessity, expunge the dependency framework from their thinking and instead embrace the audacity to defend the rights and interests of Africa in global affairs. Leadership audacity was at the heart of the launching of the Pan-African project. In fact, the late Kwame Nkrumah used to say that African leaders must neither face the East nor the West. African leaders must face forward. That was a mantra in the decolonization project. As the world is being remade to reflect shifts in the balance of power, the old audacity must be rediscovered and deployed to maximum effect and for maximum benefit. Out of the turbulence of the moment, the path for continental rebirth must be cleared, and a conscious effort must be made to extend the rebirth to global Africa. That Africa has geopolitical clout in multilateral institutions and broader global fora is evident in the wake of the conflict in Ukraine. US efforts to isolate Russia on the global stage, for example, have been largely hurt by Russia's ties in Africa. Only 10 African countries voted in favor of the US-sponsored resolution to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council in April 2023, whilst the majority of African countries chose to abstain. And in September 2023, official delegations from 48 African countries attended the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg, despite ongoing condemnation of Russia's actions in Ukraine. However, African countries were also well represented in China's Belt and Road Summit in Beijing in October 2023, and previously at the US-Africa Summit in December 2022. The choice should not be between the West and the East. Africa should be pragmatic in dealing with both sides of the geopolitical divide. Pragmatism should also mean insisting on the reform of the institutions that emerged from the post-1945 America-led order, like the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and the World Bank. Given the pressure these global governments and security institutions are experiencing now, we need to empower regional frameworks and organizations as critical building blocks for an emergent multilateral security and governance architecture. It might be tempting, based on the sheer number of bilateral summits in which African leaders have in recent times been participating to conclude that the continent is now well placed to play a core role in a new multilateral system. That assumption, in my view, is yet to be proven, given the fact that for all the plethora of summits and the pomp and circumstance of summitaries that fill the air, another one is going on in Riyadh as we speak. African countries that answer the call to meet as a bloc with Europe, the United States, Russia, Japan, China, India, Saudi Arabia, do not go to the meeting on the basis of a shared agenda. This is in sharp contrast to their hosts that all invariably have clearly defined objectives of what they want from and out of Africa in the short, medium, and long term. Unable to fashion out clear policy objectives for engaging in the various summits and failing to devise mechanisms for speaking with one voice, the various engagements have generally taken on the form of donor-recipient sessions, complete with patronizing statements and actions from the host. African leaders will need to do better than this. Even the notion of not insisting that whoever wants to meet Africa come to Africa headquarters in Addis Ababa itself is something that I believe needs to be revisited. Although there's nothing intrinsically wrong with seeking partnerships with other countries, it should be on the basis of mutual accountability and mutual benefit. To address and transcend the weaknesses in the African engagement with the changing world order, steps therefore need to be taken to fill the manifest gaps in policy and leadership. But this also places an onerous burden on African leaders at this historic moment. And perhaps most critical in this transition period is the opportunity by African leaders and institutions to collectively address the structural drivers of conflict and instability that undermine peace on the continent, with two interconnected ones particularly in desperate need of laser beam attention: poverty and inequality. A major challenge that the liberal democratic order is experiencing on the continent as a result of these structural factors is the growing dissatisfaction with electoralism. Because for many Africans, it has now become obvious that elections do not a democracy make. Liberal government models, which place a lot of emphasis on processes rather than developmental outcomes, and disproportionately favor the pursuit of private gains at the expense of more structural economic transformation, is beginning to create problems on the continent. In 2022, an Afrobarometer survey found that only 43% of respondents in 30 African countries satisfied with how democracy works in their respective countries, down 8 percentage points from a decade prior. The twin problem of poverty and inequality has in recent years been the scourge of democratic development in Africa. It is at the root of the many other discontents that have fed and fueled public anger in many African countries. And they provide the underlying context for explaining why religious extremism, ethnic redentism, intercommunal conflicts, unconstitutional change of government, gender-based violence, intergovernmental discord, intergenerational discord, and multifaceted criminality have been on the ascendant in the continent. Clearly, a primary duty of any political leadership is the incremental improvement in the welfare, social mobility, and the wellness of the citizenry, the security of the populace, cohesion of society, and the enhancement of the productive capacity of the country. These are all closely interconnected purposes of nation building and statecraft. They comprise the first-order domain of leadership action by which a just peace may be secured and sustained. Consequently, if Africa must win a seat at the global power table, African leaders must also make concrete efforts to win the hearts and minds of the majority of their own citizens. Only then will Africa stand a good chance of breaking out of old frames of thought and action that have left the continent in a prolonged state of underdevelopment and dependency, and reap the opportunity of this multipolar moment. I thank you for listening.